Good morning. Part of me thinks like I don't have to speak this morning because it's already been said, which is great. Rachel and I didn't speak to each other at all, did we, Rachel? And yet what Rachel has brought really ties in fantastically with what I'm bringing this morning. So I feel really blessed, and I feel though God has a clear message for us. We're continuing with our series on Daniel, and the title for this series is Life Without Compromise. I'm going to kind of delve straight in because there's an awful lot to unpack this morning. I'm honing in this morning on chapters 2, 7 and 8. And the reason why we've broken it up this way is because I'm particularly just looking at Daniel, the dreams and the visions that we get in this chapter. What are these dreams and what are these visions? What do they mean for Daniel then? What could they mean, or how can we apply it to our lives today? So I'm going to give a very quick whistle-stop tour of what these dreams and what these visions are. I'm then going to hone in on specific scripture, which will hopefully help to unpack it a bit further for us. So again, if you haven't read it, I would really encourage you to go home, read chapters 2, 7 and 8. I don't have time to get home and read them in full this morning, hence why I'm just going to give you a quick précis of what they are. So the first chapter I'm looking at, chapter 2, we are with King Nebuchadnezzar, who David introduced us to next week. We are in 6th century BC. We are in this era of Babylonian paganism, where this King Nebuchadnezzar kind of sits on his throne and he rules, but there are different gods in the Babylonian Empire that they are worshipping. One of the key ones is Marduk, and David unpacked some of the others for us last week as well. In addition to this, Nebuchadnezzar also wants himself to kind of be recognized during that time as well. He has a dream. And if we can have the next slide, this dream is something that disturbs him and bothers him. He dreams of this huge statue, but nobody knows the dream that he has had. And what he does is he appeals to the magicians, and he appeals to the enchanters, the sorcerers, the wise men of his court, and says, interpret my dream for me. Let me know my dream and interpret my dream for me. Yet, he gets really angry because no one can do that. No one can tell him his dream, and no one can interpret it for him. And I kind of understand that. You know, when I've watched England play, I've kind of thought, you get paid a lot of money to score goals, England. That's your job. Come on. And so I understand that feeling of Nebuchadnezzar to think, these guys, their one thing to do is to interpret my dreams and tell me what they mean. So he gets very angry, slightly more barbaric than us. He then just says, if you can't tell me what this means, I'm going to kill you all. Okay? Daniel, being in the king's court and being one of the wiser chaps of the court as well, was under this. So Daniel was in face of death if he couldn't interpret this dream. So what Daniel does, because of his immense faith that we're going to look at later, he goes to King Nebuchadnezzar and says, my God will be able to tell you your dream and what it means. Then he runs back home to Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and he says, we need to pray to God in order for him to reveal King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. God is faithful. God reveals the dream. Daniel goes back. Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar of his dream, and therefore Daniel is saved. But also King Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that Daniel's God, our God, is the one true God. This is the dream. The dream is of a statue, really typical in literature of that time, really typical of ancient dream records as well. So there's lots of ancient dream records that recognize statues of this type. Statues typically were something which connoted someone's power. And we went through a phase, if you think of Egypt in particular, the bigger the statue, the more somebody's wealth, the more their power. And so lots of times we see this reoccurring theme in kind of ancient scripts, ancient books. If you've read Ovid's Metamorphoses, it's also kind of based on this idea that statues connote this power. But Nebuchadnezzar's dream bothered him because his statue was divided. It was mixed. And actually it was mixed of this head of gold, these chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, the feet of clay, and then this crushing rock at the end. And the crushing rock is the only thing that remains. And these different kind of mediums, these different metals, represent different empires that rise up, four successive empires that rise up one after the other. First being Babylon, the second being Medes, the third being Persia. Then we get Seleucid Syria and Ptolemaic Egypt. Therefore, there's this conflict between these kingdoms that rise up one after another. However, the one that remains at the end is the rock. And that's our chapter 2. Next slide, please. We then enter what I call kind of 1980s crazy labyrinth territory. Anybody seen the film Labyrinth out there? Big fans of Labyrinth? It is like some sort of 1980s, crazy film, fantasy era that we take a step back into. And we get chapter 7. Chapter 7 now, we're under a different king, King Belshazzar. And Daniel describes how the heavenly winds make some turmoil in the waters, and out of the waters we see arise these, on the left, these four beasts. One beast is a lion with wings. One beast is a big bear with big ribs in his mouth. Another beast is the leopard with 3 heads. And then the last beast is really similar to the beast that John talks about in Revelation. It's like this big kind of beast with iron teeth, gnashing teeth, and 10 horns. Then, in this vision that Daniel has, the Ancient of Days comes and takes his seat. And after the last beast is the most terrifying and the most horrific with its 10 horns, but a son of man approaches the Ancient of Days and takes his seat next to him. And the Ancient of Days conquers this last terrifying beast. And the other beasts have their power and authority stripped from them, but are allowed to stay on earth. This dream is then interpreted for us. And really simply, there's lots of further detail in this dream. As I said, please go away and find a little bit more out about it or read the chapters yourself. But in essence, again, these 4 beasts represent 4 empires that rise up one after the other. It then becomes slightly more prophetic, and we get this final beast, this kind of really terrifying, dominating beast, is meant to represent Antiochus of Epiphanes, who comes later. He persecutes the Jews, he desecrates the temple, and he kind of establishes his own powerful reign. And the 10 horns are meant to represent these 10 Seleucid different kings that also rule. What's really, now in hindsight, what's quite fantastic about this for us is that in the scripture, it notes 2,300 days of seeing this beast to the desecration of the temple. And Antiochus of Epiphanes was actually destroyed the temple 1,150 days after his reign, which is, if we take the 2,300 as every day and every morning, half of that time is the exact time. So it is prophetic, but we also can see the fulfillment of that prophecy, which is really quite fascinating. Then we cut to the last, chapter 8. And again, we get a little bit more 1980s mythical craziness. We get a ram and we get a goat. And the ram kind of charges around. He goes to the north, he goes to the south, he goes to the west. And then a goat comes along and destroys the ram. And then the goat's horn kind of gets broken, but then this smaller horn rises up. And then again, we see at the end, Gabriel unpack this meaning and talks very much about the end times. And this becomes kind of a divine revelation. And there's kind of various different meanings, and there's particularly dual meaning, looking at revelation at the end times, but also reflecting back to this Antiochus Epiphanes, who also comes to persecute the Jews later. Fascinatingly, if you're into a bit of more history, the goat also denotes Alexander the Great and his rule, and his horn could represent the breaking of that rule when he was quite young. He died at the age of 33, and it's quite sudden. And also, his kingdom's then divided into 4, which Daniel also talks about. And then the little horn, again, is that kind of abonite, like this desolation that happens, of the Jewish people, but can also reference the end times where we see the Antichrist. But again, towards the end of those chapters as well, we see being what's dominant is God sitting on his throne. So that is a really quick précis of those different visions of the statue, the beasts, the ram and the goat. But I want to pull out the threads that are really key for us in all of this, because there's a lot you can look into and you can unpick these visions for years if you really wanted to. I don't have years this morning, you'll be glad to know. I know we're all looking forward to something tonight, so it won't take that long. However, one thing that I want to pull out, which is really a common thread throughout the whole book of Daniel, which Rachel has also kindly shared on the stage this morning, is, if we can have the next slide please, is that our God is an uncompromising God. Our God is a sovereign God. He is an everlasting God. In all of these visions and the dreams, the thing that remains at the end is our God seated on his throne. In chapter 2, verse 21, it says, he changes times and seasons. He disposes of kings and raises up others. And the statue that we had broken up into 4 kingdoms represents that these kingdoms will rise, these new kings will come up, but our God is the rock remaining at the end. We can think of that. We know it was only 100 years ago when we started to see of powerful leaders rise up. We can think of one powerful leader in particular that also tried to persecute the Jewish people. And yet we saw him rise, and yet we saw him fall. And our God still remains. You know, this is a trend throughout history. In English, I teach this poem called Ozymandias, and he represents Ramesses II. And it talks about how once there was this huge statue, and now all that remains of him is a half-buried head in the desert and just his stone feet. You know, rulers of the world will crumble. Their reign will fall. Where is Alexander Great today? But my God is still living and still active. He is a God that disposes kings and raises others up. He also has uncompromising wisdom. How crazy is this? This is the verse that I pulled out from chapter 2. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells with him. God is also, King Nebuchadnezzar is this powerful king, but he can't interpret his own dreams. He can't interpret what's in his mind. He actually has to appeal to somebody who knows, our Heavenly Father, to interpret the meaning of what he's seeing. But our God sees all things. The next slide, we've got pulled out a couple more, which says that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, but itself will endure forever. And the last verse says, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And in the middle there, I've pulled out these words from chapter 7, verse 9, Ancient of Days. And Ancient of Days is like a title that we call God, and it means that actually God was around before days. Like, that blows my brain. Like, my brain's so small, you know, but the thing is that God was around even before we had days. There was God. Even when we don't have days, there will be God. You know, he's described as the rock in chapter 2. That all of these kingdoms will come and go, but he will remain and stay. And this links particularly to Psalm 18 verse 2, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. It links to 1 Samuel 2 verse 2, there is no rock like our God. And in Isaiah 51 verse 1, when Isaiah is talking to the Jewish people who, I don't know, are a bit asleep spiritually, he says and he appeals to them, remember from the rock from which you are cut. And this morning, what I feel is really relevant for us is God's trying to paint a picture of how big, how powerful he is, yet he's saying, you're also cut from that rock. There's powerful beasts here, there's powerful things here, and yet, fell into significance. There are use the mic. Is that better? You can all hear me now. You were like, oh, which quite, way, getting this. Let me just find where I am now. Yes, so we live under the authority of the most authoritative. That's great, isn't it? That's amazing. But also, what I love is when we look at those beasts, those crazy labyrinth-esque beasts, they are a mix. They are a mishmash. Yes, they are powerful. Yes, they are terrifying, but they are also a distortion. God came and he created the leopard. He created the leopard in the way that he wanted the leopard to be created. And it was this perfect mammal that he created. And yet, what's then happened is man's come along and dreamt of, thought of, created something which is distorted. Because they want it to be terrifying and they want it to be powerful. And here I think there's a real significance that we can take from that in let's remember what is pure and what is of God. And let's be careful in recognizing what has been distorted by man. Because what our God creates will endure forever. But what man creates will be conquered. And so we've got this distinction here that we've got to recognize what is earthly versus what is divine. You know, society will twist things. We're living in a society, maybe today, we're quite privileged. We don't have to worry maybe about nations rising up against each other. Well, maybe we do. But in England at this moment, we don't have to think about actually there's rulers fighting each other or there's big power struggles fighting each other. But we do have to think about ideals. And what I'm trying to say here is in our society today, if I think about those four beasts in particularly from chapter 7, and I think, what are our beasts? What are those things that actually God made? And he made and he intended them to be good, and he intended them to be perfect, and he intended them to be wonderful, and he intended them to bless, that society's taken, twisted, distorted, and made terrifying. And you know, today's my wedding anniversary. Hello. And I got married here. We got married here, didn't we? In this church 12 years ago. And so one of those examples was not a day like today. Today's a beautiful day. That was not like my wedding day. But anyway, love and marriage is one of those examples for me. Love and marriage is something that God created. It is from God. He ordained it. It's beautiful. It's pure. It was perfect. And yet the world has taken it. The world has twisted it. The world has perversed it. And in some areas, it's actually quite terrifying. It's very powerful, the world's view of love. The world's view of marriage is really powerful in our society. It's quite prevalent in society. And yet, we need to know the rock from which we are cut. Is this making sense, church? A few people look a bit like, you're on us like a crazy thing. You lost me at the labyrinth beast. But we need to remember the truth and the rock from which we're on. You know, last week we heard about Daniel when the king presented him with all this luscious food. And he said, no, I know the food that I should be eating, the food that God has given me. And just similar like that today, there'll be loads of things that look terrifying and powerful, that we think are the most powerful things in society, but we've got to make sure that we know, no, this is the rock from which I stand. This is where I am at. This is the God. Because here, and even though it might not feel like it at the time, but our God is the sovereign God. What our God creates will last forever. The second thing that I want to look at is just when we know who our God is. When we know that our God is the sovereign God, that it doesn't matter who tries to overcome him, who tries to fight him, who tries to conquer him, what happens in society won't stand against him. Once we grasp how powerful our God is, we then have uncompromising faith. You know, Daniel knew his God. And that meant that he could then stand up. He can then go to King Nebuchadnezzar and say, I will interpret your dream for you, because he had uncompromising faith. If we could have the next slide, please. You know, we hear in chapter 2, he said, I asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a hard decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. And then it says this great line, during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And I think this is really important. I think the journey of Daniel from chapter 1 to chapter 2 is really significant. That in chapter 1, he's in the king's court. His character is really secure. He's somebody that shows great patience in saying, I'm not going to eat this crazy food of the king, but I'm going to eat the food that's ordained by my God. He shows great self-control in that. He conveys that with gentleness. And he sticks to what he knows is right and what's true. And then we get Daniel interpreting vision. And I think the ordering of that is really, really important. Last month we looked at the Holy Spirit. And I think in this church it's really safe to say that we had an increase of dreams, of visions, of pictures, of words that were gained to us. But God maybe just wants to remind us that don't neglect character. Don't neglect knowing what is right and what's wrong according to God's word. Because that's really crucial, that actually we ensure ourselves with what's right and what's wrong by God first, before then looking at interpreting vision. But I do just want to hone in on this a little bit further. I want to look at, I think there's really teachable lessons we can learn about interpreting visions and pictures. And I know that last month we did see a lot of people gaining a lot more pictures. So I just want to take the opportunity, it's just a little side note, but to do a bit of teaching on this. If we can just turn to the next slide. I'm not going to go through this all, but I don't mind sending it out. But basically there's real parallels. When Daniel interprets a vision, there's really clear kind of similarities every time he interprets a vision. He starts by noting down when it was. And I think that's really crucial. We've spent a lot of time in the senior leadership team looking back through prophecies. It's really helpful to know when those words are given, because it's helpful to see either it being fulfilled or actually we're still waiting for the fulfillment of it. He then starts by saying that he had a vision and that he was looking at it. It's almost like, and if you think I've never had a vision before, well, this is how it kind of works, it seems. That actually you are looking at it. He then, while seeing it, starts to think about it. And I think those of you that maybe have had pictures, having visions, this is something, an encouragement, that you start to have the vision, start to think, what's God trying to show here? What is this? Is this something of God? Then he goes on to say he continued to look. He continued to watch. And I think we've had that a little bit, that sometimes we've had people come to have a picture and then we've prayed into it and they've said, oh, there's something more to it. And I think let's not be hasty. Let's watch what God's showing us. Let's think about it. Let's watch some more. Is there more to come? Is there more the Lord wants to reveal? And then this is crucial. In Daniel's visions, there is then the interpretation given to him really clearly by someone divine. Whether that's Gabriel in one of the visions, whether that's somebody who passed, who looked like the son of looks like God himself. But in both the visions, there is this divine revelation or interpretation given to him. And I would say, if we've got visions, you're thinking, hang on, I don't know what that means. Wait, think, wait on God, pray into it. Wait for that divine revelation to come to interpret what you're seeing. The last bit I think is really important. The last bit, then Daniel has this decision about what to do about it. In some instance, he shares it. In some instance, he keeps it to himself. In some instance, he's appalled by it and he's still a bit baffled. And I think that's fascinating to see that even a prophet like Daniel, in some instance goes, I don't think that's something to share, even though he does write it down and millions of people have now read it. But at the time, he didn't share it. Sometimes it did disturb him. You know, sometimes people have come to me with vision and they've gone, oh, this is worrying me. And other times he has then relayed it. But I wanted to share that because I think it's quite teachable about what we've got. But we can learn further about these visions. The first time Daniel's called to do something, he interprets the dream for one man, Nebuchadnezzar. The next time, he sees 4 beasts, which relates to nations. And then the last time, he sees the ram and the goat, and Gabriel talks to him about the end times. There's this cumulative growth in Daniel's spiritual understanding. He starts by having visions for one person, or interpreting the dream for one person. It grows to nations. It grows to the end of the world. Get ready, church. This is exciting, isn't it? Yeah? This is what because our God is sovereign. He reigns. He's the living king. Remember the rock from which we're cut. So I just want to inject a bit of like prophetic excitement today. And I know that there's people that see pictures in this church. I know there's people that dream dreams, and I know. So let's not limit what God can do through that, because it is exciting. Maybe you've started to have pictures just for yourself. Maybe it's time to see if we can grow character, reach out to our calling. Maybe it's time to have something for the church or for our community or for your workplace. Maybe Keir Starmer's just had a dream. You know, maybe Gareth Southgate's waiting for that word. Some prophetic insight on how to arrange the team tonight. But I'm just saying, let's not limit our God. Like, God changed nations. He raises up kings and he disposes of them. Let's just remember what we could be capable of with God's authority. Let's think big. Let's know our God. Let's know the impact that he could have. The majority of the book of Daniel takes place in a political sphere. Hardly any of it takes place in the temple or the churches. And I think one thing that says to us is that God's revelation, God's divine intervention is meant to be to also help what's outside this building. It's great to have prophecy in the church. It's great to have vision in the church. But actually, the majority, I think, is meant to be for out there. And that's a massive challenge for us this morning. That's a massive challenge when we're at a work meeting to go, I think potentially things could look like this. Or what you've just described there, I think, could look like this. And I do also think we have a massive responsibility to recognize what is earthly and what is heavenly. What has God created and what has earth distorted. And wherever we are in our workplaces or in our schools or in our colleges or in our homes, we know the rock from which we are cut to be able to decipher that difference. I'm going to ask the band, if that's okay, to come up. And we're just going to start to play. And if the prayer team can come to the sides, there's always the opportunity for prayer here, which I think is fantastic. And I just want to encourage people for prayer for a couple of things. One is we've had lots of words about how big our God is, that the darkness cannot overcome our God, that he is sovereign. And sometimes there's this quote which says, you know, don't look to the mountain and ask it to move, but look to your God for him to move your mountain. And I just feel that this morning that if you need prayer, just to have a snapshot of how magnificent, how vast, how powerful our God is. There is a beast that is raging in your life. Maybe something has been distorted. And you think, no, I need some divine revelation, or I need to be reminded of what's heavenly rather than what's earthly, then I really encourage you to come for prayer this morning. Don't leave here without those things being untangled. Secondly, this is my little cheeky appeal, if I'm being honest. I feel like we should raise the bar a bit with our prophetic visions and our prophetic pictures. I love to hear testimonies. Stuart's already said, where are you, Stuart? You know, love to hear testimonies. He's laughing now. But love to hear testimonies. I'd love to hear testimonies of us in our workplaces. You know, let us dream of curriculums that could be taught in school which are from the Lord. Let us dream of plans that could help businesses prosper, which are from the Lord. Let us have pictures of what our families could look like so that we raise up the next generation of people who know their God. You know, so if you are somebody that has pictures or visions, let's raise the bar this morning. Let's not limit what we can speak into, because our God is such a sovereign God. So I just would ask for those people to come to pray during our final songs of worship. Thank you.